Good evening or afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our panel discussion on the first ever global conference on transition from fossil fuels that happened in Santa Marta, Colombia at the end of last month. And we are joined today by a very distinguished panel of speakers who were all present uh, at the conference in Santa Marta and have some great insights to share. Uh, but first of all, a few words about um, uh, the webinar process. You can introduce yourselves in the chat, but if you have questions, please use the Q&A button that's on the bottom of your screen. Uh, that's what we will be monitoring in order to um, uh, track the questions that you have. And also a few words about the organizations who are uh, sponsoring this. Uh, my name is Basav Sen, and I'm the Climate Policy Director at the Institute for Policy Studies, which is a progressive multi-issue think tank that has been around for more than 60 years. And uh, two other organizations who are also co-sponsoring this are the US Climate Action Network, or US-CAN, which is a network of 175 plus organizations all across the US who work on climate change at all kinds of levels, from the hyperlocal to the international. And the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative, which is an organization and a global network uh, working towards a global treaty to phase out fossil fuels. And we have representatives here on our panel from US-CAN and from the treaty who can talk a little bit more about their respective organizations. So, with that, uh, right before starting off with our panel discussion, um, a few words about what was so significant about this conference. Countries worldwide have been meeting to discuss solutions to climate change since the early 1990s. We've had 30 UN conferences of parties, or COPs, as they are referred to. And uh, for the longest time, fossil fuels, which are the key driver of the climate crisis, were not even mentioned at COP. The landmark Paris Agreement, which um, was heralded as this major breakthrough international agreement to tackle climate change, does not mention fossil fuels anywhere. And in more recent years, there have been attempts to bring up the issue of fossil fuels at the COP. And every time it has been obstructed and it has been watered down uh, by powerful, wealthy fossil fuel producing countries, notably the United States. And every year at COP, there are thousands of lobbyists from the fossil fuel industry who routinely outnumber representatives from most global south countries. And this historic conference, which our first speaker, um, Rachel Ruback, is going to describe in more detail. This conference was the first ever conference where this issue was addressed. And a few words about Rachel. Uh, Rachel Ruback is the North American project manager and a global coordinator at the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative. She's a climate justice campaigner, bringing together her academic background in global health policy and her experience building grassroots movements geared towards community care and collective resilience to fight for a just transition away from the fossil fuel economy and the extractive systems it relies on, particularly within North America. Go ahead, Rachel.
Yeah, thanks, Basaf, and hi everyone. So happy to be here with you tonight. So as Basaf mentioned, the Santa Marta conference in April is a really historic turning point in climate diplomacy, but also really the first time that countries came together to discuss fossil fuels of their own accord, to discuss not whether to phase out fossil fuels, but how to phase out fossil fuels. And it created space to really name the myriad of ways that fossil fuels harm communities around the world, from their role in the climate crisis, and their role driving carbon emissions, but also the ways that they are a driver of health harms to frontline communities, violations of Indigenous peoples' land rights, and a key driver in global conflict, as we are seeing happening right now. And, you know, for decades, they have been left out of climate negotiations, which have focused more on managing the symptoms of the crisis and really have focused on emissions, which has allowed us to sort of shift our focus away from the root cause, which is the unchecked proliferation of oil, gas, and coal. But it's also absent from many other places in our international infrastructure, and where it does come up, it is often to lock countries into fossil fuel production. For instance, many countries are required to open their fossil fuel assets to external investment as a condition of IMF loans, for instance. And so there's many different ways that fossil fuels are present throughout our international legal and financial infrastructure, but in a way that really forces us into fossil fuel dependence instead of creating ways for us to wind down fossil fuel production, even where there is political will to do so. And so the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative, where I work, it is proposing a new multilateral instrument designed to address this governance gap on fossil fuel supply. And we're recognizing that international cooperation on fossil fuels is fundamentally necessary. It's great that countries are creating national roadmaps on phasing out fossil fuels, but there's some ways that because fossil fuels are so integrated into our economic systems, they are so connected to militarism and imperialism. They are they are a main source of power, which is necessary for helping improve standard of lives for people around the world, right? Like phasing out fossil fuels is not just it's not just about like a quick switch on where we get our power from. It's going to be a really complicated process to shift our energy systems and our economic systems away from fossil fuels, especially if we want to do so in a way that is going to guarantee a just transition for the communities that have experienced the historical harms of that extraction, for communities that still rely on fossil fuels for their economies, and to make sure that we're not reproducing harms in lithium mining, for instance, or in other ways that we would maybe be shifting our energy systems away from fossil fuels, right? Like it's a complex problem that we are trying to solve, and it is one that is going to require international cooperation in order to solve it, and it is going to require a space to really sit down and have a container for specifically those hard conversations where we don't have fossil fuel lobbyists, we don't have blockers in the room, and it's not sort of a sidebar conversation to the bigger conversation at hand. We can focus directly on fossil fuels. And so the Fossil Fuel Treaty campaign is really pushing for, binding commitments on fossil fuel supply and having countries come together to create the conditions for an equitable and global just transition. In a way that would have legal and normative impact that could extend to non-party states, in a way that I can touch on later. And so this proposal, this initiative, there's currently 18 countries that have endorsed the call for a fossil fuel treaty, and 10 or 15 others that regularly attend our ministerials as observer nations, and 200 subnational governments, 11 indigenous nations, civil society from all over the world, academics from all over the world have also endorsed this call. And out of ministerial conversations between those 18 countries, they discussed the fact that we weren't going to be able to have these conversations in the way that we would want to within the processes that currently exist, especially ones where, as Basav mentioned, have such a heavy presence of fossil fuel lobbyists and producing nations that want to serve as blockers. And so the best way to be able to have these conversations would be to create a process outside of the UN and outside of the UNFCCC in particular. And so Colombia took up the call to host this space and then invited the Netherlands to co-host with them. And so, the conference sort of took on a life of its own outside of what had originally been discussed by those 18 countries. And so they announced that they were going to host the Santa Marta conference during COP last year. And in the end, 60 countries about came to the conference. And on the agenda, it included addressing economic dependence on fossil fuels, supply and demand measures, and international cooperation. Um, and so, yeah, it was a really exciting and historic conference that took place. Some complications, as any new process that is being created. Of course, there were some hiccups along the way. But yeah, 60 countries gathered, which was really exciting. And both within that process and alongside it, there were a number of conferences and venues through which Indigenous peoples, civil society, subnational governments and parliamentarians, trade unions, youth, and a number of other constituencies were able to both meet amongst themselves to discuss sort of what are our demands for this process and to then go into the high level segment and to push for the countries to meet those demands. And so, yeah, it was quite an exciting space that happened. I'm going to share just a couple of takeaways of this space and then a couple of takeaways for our movements. Um, so, when it came to the conference process itself, I think what we've heard from a lot of countries that attended was that they felt really positive about the process. It was a Chatham House rules, which means that they could share amongst themselves and not be quoted by um, media within the process. And so that created some space for some really honest conversations around fossil fuel phase out and what's going to be necessary in order to pursue fossil fuel phase out, sort of the needs and the challenges. Um, and conversations on fossil fuel phase out that haven't been able to take place within the UNFCCC. One of the really exciting outcomes is that Tuvalu announced that they would host the second conference, and then Ireland was announced as a co-host. So this is officially now a series of diplomatic conferences that we hope will lead to a negotiation mandate for a fossil fuel treaty and the adoption of binding mechanisms at the end of this process. And there was clear adoption throughout the narrative that fossil fuel transition is not just a climate issue, but requires a whole of economy transition and needs addressing structural challenges like economic dependence and indebtedness. And there was strong language on just transition, Indigenous peoples, workers, and communities and human rights based approaches at various points throughout. So, some good signals that we can be pushing this process to actually really create something that we would consider to be a just transition. Um, on the other hand, the fact that it was designed to be a safe space for countries also meant that there was some closed door restricted access for civil society, Indigenous peoples, and others. And so there was a bit of, yeah, it wasn't as inclusive as we would want. And so part of our work is to push that forward. And there is a work group that is going to take this process forward, but it is currently mostly led by Global North institutions. And so we're going to have to keep fighting to rebalance some of that power within this process. But it is a new system that is being created, and so there's space to do that. And so I think a couple of the thoughts that I have on next steps for our movements, we'll be curious to hear what the other panelists have to say, is that it's time for us to start working on concrete proposals during the People's Summit. that took place in the lead up to the high level segment. We worked on a really incredible declaration that outlined our principles and our demands, but it's not always really clear how to actually operationalize those to ourselves or to those who are in charge. And so we, and when I say we, I don't necessarily mean global North institutions and academics, I mean the full global movement, should really be now putting together proposals for what we think it would look like to meet our demands in practice. And I will just say that on the Fossil Fuel Treaty website, we have started putting together some really interesting resources around what proposals for financial mechanisms would look like that I think are both really interesting in and of themselves and also are really good templates for how we could be putting together proposals for other parts of a just transition besides indebtedness and financial mechanisms. We need to make sure that the usual suspects do not use this process to greenwash or that they're not able to degrade the process. We need to push for the Santa Marta process to result in new international architecture that includes binding mechanisms, financial support for countries and communities whose economies are dependent on fossil fuels, and meaningful processes for the inclusion of all of those who are impacted by the fossil fuel industry and by a just transition away from the fossil fuel industry. Um, and we cannot let the countries pat themselves on the back for having hosted this conference and push it back into processes where major producers and fossil fuel lobbyists have entrenched power. It's on us to figure out how to move as fast as possible in a way that is the most inclusive as possible. We have some really ambitious a timeline set for ourselves on how soon we need to be phasing out fossil fuel production and cutting carbon emissions. And we really do, like, the crisis calls on us to move fast, but we need to make sure that fast doesn't mean exclusive and that frontline voices aren't excluded from the process as a result. And so we really need to think through what it means to work as collectively as possible and as inclusively as possible on the timeline demanded by science to phase out fossil fuels in order to curb the climate crisis. And then finally, the North American countries are probably never going to be a part of this process. I mean, Canada attended, but the goal of a fossil fuel treaty or the theory of change is that you keep major producers and blocker nations out of the room to start. And so in our ideal world, you wouldn't have major producers in the room unless they have a good faith commitment to actually start ending expansion, phasing out existing fossil fuel production, and ensuring a just transition. But that doesn't mean that we don't have a moral obligation to be pushing for the end of fossil fuel expansion locally. And so, locally within our communities, and that we live in a country that has a target-rich environment. I mean, we have, state governments still have a lot of control over fossil fuels. So many of the corporations are headquartered in the US, and there's so much wealth here that we could be trying to move into the process. And so I think it's on us to be a bit creative on what global North participation in this process will look like. And it's not just pushing for our governments to participate unless they're going to participate in a good faith way, but instead to really think how we can relate to this process either by pushing for the same demands at home or by pushing for the mechanisms to allow for subnational participation, for instance, so that we could have states that participated in the treaty, even if our federal government didn't. And there's still frontline communities in North America who deserve to be a part of this process, even if our federal governments aren't. And so I think, especially for global North institutions that have traditionally had an easier time getting into these kinds of spaces and have access to resources, right now we really need to be thinking on how we make sure that frontline communities are able to get into those processes and that we are supporting the demands that they are pushing once they're in. So yeah, those are some top line thoughts from me.
Thank you for that grounding, Rachel. And with that, I'm going to invite our next speaker. Um, Shante is the Members Relations Manager at the U.S. Climate Action Network, USCAN. She's been working for the past decade to reduce harm in all aspects of life, whether it be to the earth or to individuals in the carceral system. Shante advocates that we must reduce, reuse, relearn, and transform to end climate change and other imperialistic systems of harm. And she believes in organizing at the intersections of embodied leadership, healing justice, and political education. Take it away, Shante.
Thank you, Basso. Um, Hi, everyone. Thank you for that introduction. Basso talked a little bit about what US CAN is and who we are and how many members we have, around 175. The importance of that membership is our deep membership ensures that our work is grounded not only in technical and policy expertise, but crucially also in a lived experience of those on the front lines of the climate crisis. Collectively, we build political power to ensure that the United States delivers its fair share of climate action through domestic mitigation and global support. We fight for the future that centers people and working families over corporate profit, and we believe it is essential to advance a just transition that's free from extractive economies to ones that are regenerative and rooted in community care and cooperation. Going into I want to thank Rachel for giving us the overview and really needed context for what happened at Santa Marta, kind of the before and why it's important. I came into Santa Marta as one of my first international experiences, really never going to COP, never going to any of these international bonds or anything. And I say that not to say, but to say that to like going in what I expected, what some of my highlights and goals and things that were like, oh, that feels like a win, um, might be a little different because this was my first experience and it's a good first experience, right? It's outside of the things, it was more community focused, it was more governments who wanted to do the work. Um, so again, so I think I was really thinking, Santa Marta was a vital first step. But the path to just transition must center on the frontline voices and communities to ensure we are never overlooked. We must be deeply interwoven into the core of these processes. And I think something that Rachel said that made really stood out to me is like, yes, blocking the global north, but making sure that the communities who are most impacted, those in the Gulf South, those in indigenous communities and Black communities and brown communities who are most impacted are in the room. And I feel like that is a beautiful kind of lead way into what I do and what I'm passionate about. Um, so really thinking, there was a lot of US CAN members on the ground engaging and in almost every sector of the People's Assembly. And then the Colombian government had the Assembly of the Peoples. Was it confusing? A little bit. So going forward, hoping to not have two names that are so deeply close together. Um, we did really important work that I will be proud of until and we'll continue to build on that. The importance of cross-national, cross-organizational solidarity to deliver unified messages. US CAN, in coordination with Just Transition Alliance on the ground. My colleague Shriram, who is on this call, is our policy director and really is in a lot of these spaces and did the real hard work of the papers and organizing the people before we got on the ground and made it a smooth transition for me to be there at my first conference and really be able to build and connect the pieces between communities and the work. Um, and yeah, in organizing with Just Transition Alliance, keeping us grounded that this is needs to look like workers, unions, everybody, to build the future that we want. Some key achievements that I felt really good about as a ground like rooted in organizing is that convening specifically dedicated to fossil fuel phase out planning outside of the traditional UN framework, success in bypassing COP obstructions from fossil fuel lobbyists in producing countries, um, like the countries, fossil fuel lobbyists, nations like the United States and Saudi Arabia that frequently sabotage UN COP negotiations, relationship building, always we will continue to need to build on top of that, and the relationships that I have built and continue to build with the people on this call and the people in the chat and all around is like deep work. We will never have the money. We can have the people. Like we have the people, we can win. So it's like, how do you organize the people? And I think that has to be through deep relationship building and knowledge sharing. Um, some, I think Rachel talked about like some of the good and some of the things that we need to continue to work on, but some of the things that Center for Improvement, not everybody was able to be in the room. We had folks from the continent of Africa. We had folks from Asia and some other places that I'm probably missing who weren't there. And I think the importance of like making sure we, however, like in the US, and if you are a person of privilege or like power, making sure that those voices and those people are in the room. Like, and how do we leverage our needing to be there with them actually being there? Um, so, prioritizing leadership and voices of Black and Brown women and those from the most impacted communities over simple consultation. They want our voices without us being in the room, making sure that doesn't happen and continue to build and uplift those women who should be in the room. Um, because yeah, voices were excluded. We must utilize our collective influence, ensure essential stakeholders are present, adopt a stance on non-participation if critical voices are excluded. That's kind of what I just said, but really want to be intentional about that and really like push that message through. There was I it's something that stood out on me. We've been doing a lot of debriefs that stood out is like relationship building. Um, in these like before, during. We have a year that like, and maybe it's not even a year, hopefully it's a year, but before Tuvalu. And how do we like learn from the Rachels and the Felicias and the Analias, and how do we meet those people who they know and continue to build so that like we know who's in the room, are starting to do a gap analysis to like are people here who's missing. Um, so those are some of the things. Some things that I like really, there was a lot of AI that was used, and it was used in the context of like, oh, for language, let's put it in AI to transcribe it. And we have to find a better system before the next conference because we cannot use AI. Just uh, get up off that. There ended up being like some side panels that ended up being more harmful than good. If we are moving together, we need to move together, not before or after or during. How do we make sure that the conversations we are having, that when what I say, Rachel is saying, that Felicia is saying, and I'm saying these people because these are your panelists, you should, like, it's like we are all delivering the same message. Behind closed doors, we can say something else, but together, out in front, out in public, those are the things, and that's how we're building together. Because we ended up having some North American, particularly like German folks, white men who kind of tried to undermine the process of putting out a paper, and it's need to be called out and shamed. It's late. My filter is off a little bit, so take it how you will. Um, Role and coordination. We all know that the US was not a part of the Santa Marta process. It is actively leading the expansion of fossil fumes, it is actively leading harms and deaths around this globe and inside empire. Um, so we have to build in regenerative practices in deepening community solutions and outcomes, and implementing them, leaning on pushing for subnational governments. And we do that by building bridges between local, national, and global together. Again, people power, we win. And at the end, I'll read a quote that like is the thing that keeps moving me forward. Moving forward, lessons learned are alternative diplomatic spaces outside of the UN COP. We have to keep building these spaces. I think the Fossil Fuel Treaty is doing that great work. And how do we uplift that? How do we keep yeah, and as I think Rachel said really well, is like making sure global North and global South folks are talking and we're interwebbed. Um, Process for repair where harms happen. When building long-term movements, we must actively work to combat harm. We are all doing this together. We are all hopefully showing up as our best self, but intentionally like calling out harm, maybe not in front of the, calling in. Let's call in folks to create, not to break harmful behaviors and truths and like really like how do we move forward if we can't do that in great relation is like really what I'm thinking about. Like, and then there's like some harmful things that you're gonna have to, you know, but I'm an abolitionist that I dream big. We find solutions together. Um, And really, how do we sustaining the momentum from Santa Marta and continuing the push for global fossil fuel treaty, phase out treaty? These conversations that we are having right now develop a strategy to support and amplify the work of those situated in Tuvalu too. Like, what are people in the island saying? Like that, making sure those are webbed into our conversations. We know that this island is really excited about the work and has been doing the work, and like how are we pushing that um, forward in their voices, and how are we connecting them to the most impacted in the global north, the global south, and all around. Integrating contributions so that the final reports genuinely reflect the debates and inputs of all participants. I'm going to reiterate that, right? No more dangerous distractions, CCSs, bioenergy, fossil gas as transitional fuel and offsettings are distractions. We want no false solutions. It's the only way forward. Um, and I think, to really push, Rachel's like, Shante has said my name so many times, but you went first and you set the groundwork. So now just like trying to, um, we need solutions that address the root cause of the crisis, such as fossil fuel non-proliferation treaties. We do this together. Um, and everyone that we teach one, we can bring people into this. Everybody wants to drink clean water. Everyone wants a place for their children to run. Everyone wants a place where the future generations don't have to worry about these harmful impacts. And we do that by listening to each other. And something that I have an Octavia Butler quote that I'm like really living deeply in. We can each do the impossible as long as we convince ourselves it has been done before. Thank you.
That was beautiful as always. Thank you, Shante. And with that, I'm going to introduce our third speaker. I announced this in the chat, but just to repeat for anyone who may have missed it. Unfortunately, one of our speakers, Tom Goldtooth from the Indigenous Environmental Network, could not join us today. So we are not going to be hearing from him. And our third speaker is my colleague at IPS, Felicia Guillen. She's the New Mexico Fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. She's a Chicana environmental justice organizer from rural New Mexico and an organizer with the New Mexico No Fault Solutions Coalition, where she leads and supports state and national campaigns challenging oil and gas expansion and false climate solutions. Her work emphasizes the links between climate justice, anti extractivism, and demilitarization, highlighting how imperialism, resource extraction, and environmental racism are deeply interconnected. Across all of her work, Felicia is committed to building cross-border solidarity, confronting systems of extraction, and advancing a future where frontline communities lead a just transition. On to you, Felicia.
Thank you so much, Basaf, and for Rachel and Shantae for covering a lot of ground. My comments specifically, obviously, as Basaf mentioned, I'm from New Mexico, and I've very deeply ingrained within frontline and grassroots movements in New Mexico. So a lot of my contexts are going to be framed within this region. And so I think, the first question that I really want to answer is what would a just process of the follow-up work post Santa Marta look like? And what can our movements here in the so-called US do to ensure that this process is in fact just? I think for movements in New Mexico, a just follow-up process to the Santa Marta conference must begin with really a deeper political understanding of what a just transition actually means and who is controlling it, right? We're living through a moment where governments and corporations are finally being forced to acknowledge that fossil fuels must end, but many of the current pathways being proposed are very much still rooted in extraction and militarism and colonialism and really corporate control. And so, when we're thinking about a just transition, it simply cannot replace, one sacrifice zone with another. And in New Mexico specifically, we are seeing how a green transition narrative is being used to justify these new forms of extraction and of infrastructure expansion, right? We're seeing the rollout of hydrogen projects. We're seeing carbon capture and storage. We're seeing AI data centers that are powered with the need for this massive energy demand. We're seeing our pueblos and the Navajo Nation being opened for uranium mining. We're seeing nuclear expansion. And so globally, the rush for critical minerals, for batteries, for solar infrastructure, are reproducing many of the same dynamics that built the fossil fuel economy in the first place. And so kind of like what I think was like critically missing from the conversations within our movements in Santa Marta was talking about we miss talking about critical minerals, right? Because if we're placing fossil fuel extraction with lithium extraction, with copper extraction, uranium, militarized mining corridors. Is it actually a just transition, or are we, simply restructuring capitalism into this new wave of green colonialism, right? And so for myself and other folks who are maybe frontline organizers or, New Mexico-based organizers, you know, back to what Shantae was saying, we really do need to build direct relationships with movements who are confronting these realities at a global scale, right? We have to do political exchange. We have to mutually develop strategy together. And we must build like long-term relationships across, these borders. And we also like have to confront internal contradictions within our own movements, right? Shantae and Rachel, you guys alluded to this a little bit. There are massive wealth gaps between large NGOs and frontline grassroots organizations, and so too often, like our frontline communities are brought into this process when the decisions have already been made. And, institutions with greater resources often dominate the strategy, they dominate the messaging, and they dominate the access to the space itself. And so, a just process requires shifting resources and decision-making power and actually building out the long-term infrastructure that grassroots orgs need. Um, to confront the powers of extraction and of environmental racism, right? And so, just consider like, what does it look like to invest in political education and leadership development within our grassroots communities? What does it mean to actually fund long-term organizing instead of short-term campaigns? What does it mean to build multilingual and rural organizing infrastructure? And what does it actually mean to like create democratic movement structures where frontline communities actually do lead the process? Like one of the things that came out of Santa Marta was the People Summit Declaration. It was powerful. Like we spent days working on this declaration. However, I don't think it was enough, right? We really need to start organizing our own communities and our own systems and actually building out these mechanisms for our demands to actually be implemented, which I know Rachel has talked a lot about, right? And so this means actually asking and like really thinking deeply about, what would community-owned energy systems look like? What does a worker-led and indigenous-led transition look like in the Permian Basin? How do we actually build local food, water, mutual aid systems that are capable of actually surviving climate chaos, collapse and political instability, which we are in, like we are in the thick of it. And how do we also reduce our dependence on economies while making sure that our communities are financially and monetarily and materially supported? And how do we create a durable movement infrastructure that is actually capable of surviving this repression and this co-optation of our movements? And so, I think leading towards Tuvalu in the beginning of 2027, we have to center frontline leadership. We have to center anti-colonial analysis and anti-imperialist politics, grassroots democracy, redistribution of resources, and really like builds the real alternatives to, this extractive capitalism. Because if we're not, then this risks becoming like another mechanism through which corporations and wealthy nations, really reorganize power while our frontline communities continue to absorb this violence. And so, yeah, that's kind of like my thoughts on. I have so many thoughts following Santa Marta. Like, I am so overwhelmed by everything that I'm thinking and trying to strategically think through. The second question that I really do want to answer is like, how can our movements in the US make the outcomes of the conference relevant to our organizing work here? And Rachel, I want to give a shout out to Rachel because Rachel has made me such a better like strategic thinker and how we actually move our local movement work forward. I think this is like a really vital question, like New Mexico itself is one of the epicenters of expansion through the Permian Basin. We, extract 6.3 million barrels of crude oil per day. And we're becoming the testing ground for many of the false solutions that are being promoted in these international spaces, right? And so we must and we have to confront like the full system of extraction, right? That includes imperialism and includes militarism, colonialism, all these isms, and we have to recognize as well, which I think some of the mainstream climate movement forgets, that the US military is one of the largest institutional polluters in the world. And these discussions sometimes are completely excluded from, yeah, these mainstream climate discussions, right? Like in New Mexico, we're seeing the expansion of plutonium pit production at Los Alamos National Labs. We see the expansion of nuclear weapons infrastructure, militarized research economies through, our universities, which are directly tied to our extractive systems in New Mexico, as well as, this general building of empire. And so, it's really important that we recognize that the same government that is funding fossil fuel expansion in our communities is also funding endless militarism abroad. And at the same time, corporations are using the climate crisis itself to justify new forms of extraction, right? AI data centers are a clear example of this. Across the Southwest right now and in the Sun Belt region, companies are demanding enormous amounts of energy and electricity to power this AI infrastructure. And now it's being like paired with these proposals for nuclear expansion, for natural gas build out, for carbon capture schemes. And all of this is like really being framed by the industry right now as this technological progress that we need in order to not fall behind, right? But we know that this just like intensifies resource extraction. And so I think movements here in New Mexico have a huge opportunity to connect our local fight to like a much larger global, analysis. Because I think the outcome specifically of Santa Marta and definitely of Tuvalu will become relevant when we then connect the Permian Basin extraction to these global fossil fuel politics. And, when we expose fossil solutions being marketed as transition pathways, and, once we start as a whole connecting anti-war, anti-imperialist organizing with climate justice, right? And we organize around a vision of a transition that is rooted in public good rather than corporate profit, right? And like this is also, I think, a reflection that I'm like trying to understand too, that we need to move from resistance to construction, right? We have to begin building our political and social infrastructure necessary in order to like really force a just transition into existence, right? So for folks like me who organize in local communities, what does it mean to build stronger grassroots coalitions? What does it mean to create regional, local, community-based just transition frameworks? What does it look like to start supporting worker organizing and community ownership models? What does it look like to start expanding our popular and political education, developing our rapid response infrastructure during climate disasters, and really strengthening our international solidarity networks, right? Because I think it's one thing to, I think it's really important to translate these international demands really into our local organizing strategies that are actually capable of building people power, right? So, especially in New Mexico, like the Permian Basin, what does it look like to start organizing a just transition framework? What does it mean to continue supporting indigenous-led resistance to extraction? What does it mean to build direct relationships with folks in the global south who are resisting green colonialism? And what does it mean to like confront the influence of fossil fuel money in New Mexico politics? Because that is huge. And also like what does it mean to develop a movement infrastructure but beyond election cycles and beyond, these NGO timelines and beyond funders' interests? And most importantly, like we need to recognize that the fight against fossil fuels is not just an environmental fight. I know a lot of us here know that. But it's a class war. We're currently living like in a class war, right? So it's a struggle over land, labor, democracy, colonialism, militarism, and who gets to shape the future. And so really it's not about whether fossil fuels end, it's about whether the systems that created this crisis in the first place remain intact or whether, our movements are actually working to dismantle them. And so I'll stop there and pass it back to Basov.
Thank you, Felicia. That was visionary. And with that, I'm going to introduce our last speaker for this evening, Analia Schleger dos Santos from Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light. Analia is the EJ Youth Program Director and Global Climate Justice Coordinator at Minnesota IPL. She's an Afro-Brazilian American woman born and raised in North Minneapolis, Minnesota. She created and directs Youth Empower, a program that trains young people on community organizing through the lens of environmental justice since 2019. She's a lead organizer for Climate Reparations Camp, and directs Shift Us, focusing on cultural shift and harm repair. She's passionate about expanding access to all forms of education, healing, and building relations, both hyperlocally and globally, and redefining power as we know it. She's excited to actualize building a global beloved community that centers environmental and relational wellness. And I love this last part of her bio, and continuing to write joy and love into everything she does. And knowing Analia, she really does. And on to you.
Thank you, dear Vasav. Okay. Really appreciate everyone showing up and just am so honored to share this conversation space with some people that I just learned so much from and that help me to understand better about how I can be in right relation in this work. So I just really admire each of you, brilliant ladies. All right, everyone. So I am the last to go, and this is my last Santa Marta debrief, and I have thoughts. I wrote some things down so I don't just rant at all of y'all. I see my mother is here too, so mom, forgive me. But I'm gonna break this down into kind of like the good and the bad. And I think that just, quickly naming that everyone, Rachel and Felicia and Shantae have covered the majority of everything that has happened both at this conference and as a result of it in a really brilliant and delicate and intentional way. So I'm going to try to maybe fill in some extra gaps from my experience and hopefully lead us into some takeaways and my current assignments. So, okay. For a little bit of background, and thank you, Basav, so much for reading those words about me. I currently focus a lot on, in my work, on U.S. fair shares and reparations. Um, as a lot of us in movement space know, we are in the country that has the highest historical emissions. That is full stop. The US has the highest historic responsibility. Um, this conference was a coalition of the willing. Our country will never be a part of the coalition of the willing as it stands. So, those contexts are very necessary to name, and I think everyone already touched on them. And wherever it is possible, y'all all who are watching this need to be naming that same thing. So that is a very necessary context that informs a lot of my perspective and my experience in this process. Okay, so the first part of my good, as I was raised to understand there's only good and very good, was that it happened. That is a happening. This was a happening. It was an experience. An insane amount of work, care, attention, funds, time, and intention got infused into this conference. I think some of the biggest takeaways from an event such as this that happened to this extent is that it was pulled off by any means necessary. Some of us have had to get real well versed in flying the plane as we are building it, which is both a superpower and an insane reality. And so this was very much like so much time and care had been put into this, and it was kind of like we need to get there and press play. And so this was a historic happening and it needs to be celebrated in and of itself. It happened. This by any means necessary reality is a win in and of itself, and that's a blessing. So second, I got to be a delegate with the first official delegation at any international climate fora with the Afro-descendant delegation. Again, there have been 30 COPs, there have been 30 conferences of parties where we have tried to address climate change, and there has never been a delegation of people of African descent. There has never been. So to participate in this circumstance in that way was a blessing, revelatory, exciting and terrifying and a challenge, and also like it felt like when a baby giraffe is like birthed and is on 6 feet legs and somehow stands. like that, the work that has gone into creating a global delegation of Afro-descendant folks is long, been a long process, but to show up in this way with that invitation really shows that this process was an intention to move in a different direction or to move in, the same direction in a different and better way. That really compounded the historic context of this happening. Uh, Next, I think that it's very necessary to name, and everyone touched on this, but hundreds of people, organizations, collectives, and networks came together to collaborate on the collective demands via the People's Summit. And we're summarized with the People's Summit Declaration, which is available for everyone to see. I'm not sure if you guys are going to send that out after, but it's available for viewing. Um, we have our line items and we have our non-negotiables as broken down by sector and by region. And it was really cool for a lot of folks present to be able to participate in something that was probably the highest level that a lot of participants had been able to meaningfully participate in before. So like that experience was really beautiful and it really made the process of how we determine international climate or just international decision-making processes. How do we do that from a people and community-centered perspective? It was really cool to be a part of that. Um, so we have the People Summit Declaration. There are parts of it where I was, some folks here will tell you, just adding things directly at very late at night, and others added, whole page long multi-paragraphs of AI generated script that honestly we were like, we have to remove that because what? Um, but to participate in some document that we can move forward from with and in service to felt like a very special experience. And a few of us were up until midnight and later on the Saturday night before, the high level process, synthesizing 1,000+ organizations' thoughts and community and civil society perspectives into this happening. And so I think that the declaration was a really beautiful, conglomerate of what we want to see. And it laid some necessary historical context. And as I'll get to later, that cannot be the place that we stop. That is a starting point. Part of that declaration named that the extraction that led to a fossil fuel dependency and all of the other issues that are amplified by the climate crisis is directly connected to the transatlantic slave trade. The People's Summit Declaration is in two parts, the global context and our demands. It is a very long document with many sections, and you should have heard us synthesizing. Shantae and I were there. Felicia, you were there too. Losing our minds on Saturday night at a hotel with people we've been with all day, trying to figure out how to pinpoint certain sections. So, section 2 of part 1 under A2, this is how our conversations went, of the People Summit Declaration states the following, which I want to read for you guys. The historical roots of this extractivism that led to the fossil fuel industry independency trace back to the first colonial conquests of peoples and the establishment of the first militarization with global extraction, which the fossil fuel industry follows today. Extractivism and global imperialism are also rooted in the transatlantic slave trade and have elevated countries responsible for the ongoing effects of colonialism and colonization. These countries utilize global imperialism to establish and foster fossil fuel dependence. Acknowledging this specific historical continuity, is crucial for demanding reparations for all peoples, communities, and nations whose lives, resources, and economies have been subjugated and continue to be exploited for profit accumulation. This declaration, in the final context and language, named what we know to be true and what we cannot avoid any longer. We cannot avoid the reality that the fossil fuel dependency in its bones was birthed out of the transatlantic slave trade. Those facts are inextricable. We cannot avoid that anymore. This conference was hosted by two countries that are heavily affected by either their participation and driving of the transatlantic slave trade and extractive expansion by any means necessary, or in Colombia's case, their cultural, systemic, racial history in the context of the current political climate has been shaped by these ongoing historical effects. So by the Netherlands and Colombia hosting this, there's no more coincidences in the universe. There are no more. There was a reason why those two countries in particular, were brought to the table. And so it should lead to what happened to a a better way of moving forward. And that to me and many others is really an opportunity for nation states to honor their history and ensure that the same history never happens again. The Dutch, the the Netherlands has a lot of work to do to address this reality. Same as the United States and same as Colombia. My next good thing is that the Afro-descendant delegation had a lot of support from the Colombian government. And this really led to an experience that felt good in a lot of spaces and a lot of opportunities, in comparison to a lot of other processes like the UNFCCC or other UN processes. And that really shows us what can happen when we operate from an understanding that those of us that have been intentionally left out of decision-making spaces must be meaningfully supported and uplifted to intentionally and powerfully lead us collectively towards a just transition. What does it look like when we actually do the thing that we say we're about? This was an example of that. Okay, I know I'm a little bit past time, but I'm going to switch to the bad. And again, there's only good and very good. But the less good that happened in this conference was, to me, first and foremost, we're late to the game. And I say that not so that everyone here feels criticized or that the movement feels criticized, but we need to keep it very real with ourselves as people in movement space and as community members. We are behind. Those in the treaty and many other frontline communities and activists and organizers have been fighting for a treaty. And now people are playing catch up, and it's extremely frustrating. The same goes for the COP process. Um, okay. Uh, it is extremely upsetting that this is the first time we're addressing this or beginning to, but this is the effects of all the barriers and the lack of willingness and political will, as the US says, to address the real matters and have the difficult conversations that have driven the climate crisis and other overlapping crises. So, we are playing catch up. Number two, there were significant representation gaps, as everyone named already, namely farmers and fisherfolk and our relatives in a lot of global South countries. It was pointed out daily by attendees that there was a notable and noticeable lack of representation from many of our relatives in African countries, Asian countries, island nations, and other global South communities. Countries that were responsible for the approval of visas and sorry, there's my note. Countries that were responsible for approvals of visas just didn't make it happen. And why is it that certain countries weren't represented there? It's African people. So there's also the anti-Blackness that has to do with that. And it's just people from the global South. Many people asked why this would happen, and frankly, hashtag racism. And that the powers that be don't really want us to all be at the table when part of occupying a seat at the table actually includes our relatives naming the truth of their lived realities and moving towards actual systems of just transition. And that just transition, if we're being quite honest, is both happening and in some cases will not be allowed to happen by those in power. So even the fact that, certain applications were left to sit on certain countries' desks is an indication of that. There was a massive communication and language gap. This is reflective of the UNFCCC process as well, where only officially 6 languages are interpreted in official rooms. So if you don't speak one of those 6 languages, you're kind of like, sorry. But if you cannot afford to pay for a personal interpreter, people like myself, who are not trained interpreters or translators, end up needing to figure out how to fully integrate the voices of frontline communities and civil society. Um, and one of the last things I'll say, and I'm breezing through everything because I know I'm past my time, patriarchy as a single solitary sentence. We named in our delegation's sectoral day that petromasculinity has brought us to this point. It has come out of this obsession with infinite growth, and it continues to drive the systems and the perpetrators of harm in a funded, organized, and dedicated way. If you look at the United Nations photos of the heads of state, women are like 2% of those heads of states, and those represent over 50% of the planet's population. Women, our youth, are the most impacted historically and presently by the climate crisis, violence, ownership, etc. And we have fallen out of right relation with our first mother, the earth, and that is why we gathered here. So inherently, we're in wrong relation from a long time ago. And we know that countries like the so-called US use a toxic masculinity to continue to harm communities locally and globally. We know these things. And yet, even in this historic happening, the first time we've ever been brought to the table as a coalition of the willing, the theme across the entire week in all sectors, regions, meetings, etc., was that patriarchy still maintained a chokehold on our spaces, on our bodies, on our conversations, and therefore our attempts to move towards a just transition. This was an infuriating reality. And it really permeated the Santa Marta conference. And we do not have the option to not address this constant avoidance and the continued harms caused and by whom they're being continued by. And so we're really being asked to move in a different way. Men took up a lot of the space, and women did the work silently. And that is not a reflection of this particular conference only, that's a larger issue. And so we had to address that in our delegation because, again, we showed up for the first time officially. So if we're going to show up in the first time in a different way, how are we ensuring that the same systems of harm don't keep happening and the same patterns keep permeating everything? We can't allow it. And the last thing I'll say is that the youth had their shite together and we did not uplift them. That's a bad on us adults. So what happens next? I know I'm way over my time, but my last couple, maybe 2.5 things are that women and youth are going to be leading what happens next. That is not an ask. That is going to be what's happening. We have an opportunity to really lean into what repair and reparations, because reparations was listed. What do those topics actually look like in practice? That is our next assignment. What does repair look like in Cancer Alley? What does repair look like in Bahia in Brazil? What does repair look like in the Niger Delta, or in the Philippines? That is tangible, it is actionable, it is, oh gosh, what am I listing? The SMART goals? There's SMART goals that could be attached to all of this, right? But like we do have our asks. We have to move beyond asks and set the standard with here's what we're going to be seeing, and it is led by communities. Here is what we insist on seeing, or we are not going to continue moving forward in this way. And so that's part of my personal assignment is to really start to pull together what actual policy could look like or what components of a treaty would look like that actually address or begin to address harms done. Because, reparations is an attempt, it will never be enough. And we do not have an option to not start getting the ball rolling. So I will stop there.
Thank you, Analia. And um, who better to take on patriarchy than our amazing all-women panel? And with that, we can get into the Q&A. And there's several really interesting questions. One of them is from a person who had to leave, and therefore we are not going to address their questions now. We can follow up with them later. But I want to start with a very basic question, which is how is just transition being defined in this space? And that would mean like in the Santa Marta process. And this is something it would be great if all of you could provide a brief answer to. And, any one of you can start.
I'm happy to jump in here. My elders back in New Mexico, very much function off the HEMES principles of democratic organizing and the principles of environmental justice. And one of the things that they say is that we speak for ourselves. And so I think in general, a just transition looks like a lot of different things for a lot of different communities. And so it should be the communities on the front lines actually, deciding what a just transition looks like for them. But I think specifically in the context of the Santa Marta process. In my conceptualization, we define just transition as moving away from economies that have been built on sacrifice zones and exploitation towards systems that are very much rooted in care, in community self-determination, in, indigenous sovereignty. Um, and so, yeah, I think it really does depend on, where you're coming from. I think for movements in spaces like New Mexico, this actually does require a lot of difficult questions about what kind of transition is actually being proposed. As I mentioned, if we're just replacing fossil fuels with, the extraction of critical minerals, is it a just transition at all? I think we did a really good job in Santa Marta of tying a just transition as well to also being connected to anti-imperialist and anti-militarist analysis, right? As I mentioned, like we cannot separate war, border violence, and global systems of economic domination from a just transition. And so if a transition continues to rely on these militarized supply chain, on corporate profit, on extraction from the global south, then it's not considered just at all. And so I think we had a mutual understanding in Santa Marta that, a just transition very much is being grounded in frontline leadership and, really this grassroots power and those that are most impacted by extraction are often those who are most closest to the solutions. And so, yeah, I don't think necessarily that it was being defined as what exactly we are transitioning away from, but, what are we transitioning towards? Which I think for a lot of us, that looks like collective liberation. It looks like, ecological justice and, really systems that allow people, planet, youth, women, etc., to all thrive.
Yeah, I can share a few thoughts. I think within the process itself, I think the closest that we're getting to just transition so far is that we're really focusing on economic dependence on fossil fuels and the ways in which, in particular, countries and communities have been extracted from and also forced into those extractive relationships by the international economic infrastructure that exists, and in particular, the way that debt has been leveraged against countries to trap them in fossil fuel expansion. And so in particular, like within the conversation that happened at Santa Marta, there was a lot of conversations around debt relief for countries. As it relates to fossil fuel production, and then also how to make sure that there is financing to make sure that countries' economies aren't left with large gaps. I mean, there's this like crazy cycle that happens, which is that countries that are on the front lines of the climate crisis need to borrow money in order to adapt their health systems, in order to yeah, invest in like climate adaptation in their countries. In order to borrow money, you need to have a good international credit rating. And in order to have a good international credit rating, they need to not have stranded assets in terms of fossil fuels, which means that in order to have the credit rating necessary to borrow money to adapt to climate change, they need to have their fossil fuel assets open to international investment. Like there are just all of these different double-edged swords in the international system for countries and communities on the front line. And so within the process so far, that's really like the main element of just transition that's been explored um, to the greatest degree during the Santa Marta process. I think that, yeah, as Felicia was saying, like really making sure that every community that is going to be impacted by the transition has a voice in what that looks like, is sort of the what the definition of a just transition needs to be collectively defined by those on the front lines, which means that in order to get to that definition, we need to make sure that they can be a part of this process. And so there's like elements of it that are starting to emerge from conversations that happened in the People's Summit, from the collective demands that were created from within the Santa Marta process itself. But I think the couple of things to stress is that like right now it's really about making sure that everyone who needs to be a part of the conversation is there to collectively come up with that definition, that the transition away from fossil fuels can't replicate international harms and can't leave communities without I think like we're seeing even within the US context, a number of refineries have closed recently in a way that has taken jobs from the community, meant that the local communities don't have the tax revenue anymore, and that the infrastructure was not actually like decommissioned and cleaned up, that companies just got out. And so any kind of transition that's happened so far has been done in a way that prioritizes companies' needs over local communities. We've seen that in the American Rust Belt. Like, we know what happens when companies are left to their own devices on how they're going to transition. And so, yeah, and so I think that, like, in particular, really stressing that this needs to be a community-led vision of what a just transition looks like, but then that there needs to be like mechanisms and a work plan to make that happen. I think on the other hand, we're going to see with the oil shortage from the US war of choice on Iran, what an unjust absence of fossil fuels from the global market looks like. And so, yeah, and so I think in particular, like really making sure that we have a really well thought out plan for how we are going to execute on the vision of a just transition, because like a vision is great, but a lot of it is like in the nitty gritty, is like where we see whether or not communities' needs or companies' needs are actually prioritized. And so like using this process as a way to create actual mechanisms, plans, funds, etc., I think is going to be necessary to make sure that the transition is just in practice and not just in principle.
I'm gonna name that I feel like Rachel, Emily, and Felicia just said everything that my spirit actually like dreams of. So thank you guys. Uh, I'm gonna start saying that a just transition, as it's defined, is an actual transition. An actual transition cannot happen if it's not just, in its embodiment, in its intention, but intention is different than actual embodiment and impact. Um, a transition cannot happen without the leadership of those of us that have been the most impacted. Full stop. It cannot be actual. It cannot be actualized unless, we are naming what has brought us to this point. It literally cannot happen. Um, so I think I operate under that understanding that a just transition is our only option. We don't have time to slowly and surely ease our way into it like a hot tub. Like, we don't have time for that anymore. So, in order for some sort of actual transition to a new way of being, or to this world that we know is possible, that we can dream up of left and right, um, it must be just in how we embody the things we say we're about. Shante?
The only thing I will add on, because I think you all said it so beautifully, and is that it is really moving from extractive economies to regenerative economies, and we need to start planning our regenerative economies. We need to start locally and building out, but also like having international solidarity and connection. because what other people like, we learn from each other, but also making sure that seeds are shareable, like that people can continue to do their heritage and seed sharing for generations, right? Of like, how do we plant food? Like, I don't, one of my things that I tell myself I'm going to do all the time is like, I grow okra every year. I don't love okra, but I try to cook with okra because I want my kids to be in the soil. I want them to be with okra. I want them to be with seeds from their ancestors that was come over. And I hope that my kids continue that. I hope that they learn to love okra. You know, but it's just like even starting small, like in your home, I grow indigo. I try and I try to grow most of the things we eat in the summer. And that is like, and I do that in practice with other people. So those are some of my solutions that I'm like starting small, right? Like what can I grow in abundance that maybe my neighbor doesn't, and then we're trading. You know what I mean? So that like I know long-term solutions, as long as I can feed my families, I can sustain this myself in this movement. And that's all.
Thank you all for the very insightful answers. And I think we have time for only one more question. And um, uh, so the question goes, I know Canada was represented, but yet the Canadian government is promoting new fossil fuel projects such as new pipelines and fracking and LNG. How was that received? And the same question could also apply to Australia or Norway, some of the other countries who are present. So, what was the politics of their presence? How was it received, like the question said? And also, was there any evidence that they tried to obstruct a meaningful outcome? And again, just in the interest of time, maybe two people answer this instead of all four, if that's okay.
Yeah, so I think a couple of things, Boss, exactly as you said, there was a lot of countries there that are actively engaging in fossil fuel expansion at the moment. Um, and so maybe a couple of things that I will say in response to that is that Canada was, I think, had like the least strong mention of fossil fuels in their actual intervention during the process, probably unsurprising. But I don't think that we found that fossil fuel producers were a particularly suppressive force in the conversations, except where there's like complicated international diplomatic relationships between two countries who are in the room that maybe like made countries, it's hard to speak out when someone who sorry, gives you international assistance is in the room with you. And so there was still like some of that kind of dynamic that played out, but I don't think that there was the same suppression of speech that happened in this space that we've seen happen in the UNFCCC space. I and I think someone mentioned this in the comments, but we did have subnational leaders from a lot of those same countries who were a bit stronger than their national governments were. And so I think that's a good sign. Um, I think on the question of how it was received politically, I think this is just an interesting tension in the different theories of change, which is that this is designed, sorry, to be a process of like the coalition of the willing, the countries that are ready to move forward. And we have seen it work at the international level before, that a small group of countries start negotiating something outside of the UN system, and then it either moves into the UN system or stays outside but builds pressure. It worked with landmines, it worked with nuclear, it worked with chemical weapons. It's how we won treaties on those topics. And in particular, a lot of times it started with the countries that didn't use those things or didn't produce them, and it shifted norms in a way that pressured the behavior of other countries. And so I think that's going to be possible with this process. One of the mechanisms that the Fossil Fuel Treaty, for instance, has been exploring is like a buyer's club, where countries would say, we're only going to buy fossil fuels from countries that are actively phasing out production. And so there's ways to like leverage the collective capacity of who's in the room against the rest of the countries. And so, yeah, like those types of things can exist whether or not there's producers in the room, because Colombia is a producer. I mean, Santa Marta is a coal port town. It's why it was chosen to be there. You could see the fossil fuel production that was happening in Colombia happen as you flew into Santa Marta. And so producers are going to be a part of this block, hopefully. The question is, how soon do you bring them in especially countries that are actively expanding based on like how ambitious you want the early conversation to be versus how much you want to create a block that's ready to pressure them and then pull them in as second movers. So I guess all of that is to say that like it didn't really seem to suppress conversation about ending expansion in the room. I think there's just different theories of change on like when you bring producers into the conversation, but we're going to have to bring them into the conversation at some point. So a complicated political dynamic that is playing out.
Thank you. Anyone else wants to answer briefly? If not, considering the time, we could wrap up today's webinar. And a huge thank you again to all four of our amazing speakers. And a huge thank you to everyone who attended. I hope people took away some important insights from this. And bye, everyone.
Big up friend Irie.